You've been nothing but a walking ATM for this family, Mom. Just hand over the money and let the real adults handle the wedding planning." My daughter Courtney's words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, and I felt something inside my chest crack, not break, but crack, like the first fissure in a dam that's been holding back 30 years of accumulated pressure. I was standing in my own kitchen, the one I'd been cooking in for 3 decades, looking at my 28-year-old daughter, who was demanding I liquidate my entire retirement savings, $67,000, for her destination wedding in Tuscany. She stood there with her arms crossed, tapping her designer heel against my linoleum floor, while my husband George nodded along from his recliner in the living room, like one of those bobblehead dolls you see in car windows. The morning sunlight streaming through the window, I'd washed just yesterday, caught the highlights in Courtney's professionally colored hair that had cost me $300 at the salon last month, when she'd claimed it was an investment in her professional image for a job interview that never materialized. "Courtney, that money is for my retirement," I said quietly, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The counter I'd scrubbed clean after making her favorite breakfast, Belgian waffles with fresh strawberries, hoping to soften her up before she made whatever request had brought her to my house at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. "Your father and I have been saving for 25 years so we could have some security in our old age." She laughed, actually laughed, and it was the kind of sound that makes you understand why some animals eat their sound. Young. The laugh started in her throat and bubbled up through her nose. A sound I remembered from her teenage years, when she thought everything I said was hopelessly naive and outdated. "Mom, let's be realistic here. You're 62 years old. You're not going to live forever, and when you're gone, that money's coming to us anyway. Why not let us have it now when we can actually enjoy it?" The words settled into my bones like winter cold, seeping through my cardigan and the cotton blouse underneath, chilling me from the inside out. I realized this wasn't the first time she'd calculated my death into her financial planning. This was just the first time she'd said it out loud, with the casual brutality of someone discussing the weather or the price of gas. Her eyes were bright with excitement as she spoke, as if she was sharing good news instead of planning my funeral. George cleared his throat from the living room, and I could hear the creak of his recliner as he leaned forward to insert himself into our conversation. "Angela, maybe we should consider it. It's not like we need all that money right now, and Courtney's happiness is important." His voice carried that tone he'd perfected over 30 years of marriage, the one that suggested I was being unreasonable while he was being the voice of wisdom and moderation. Important. Courtney's happiness was important, but apparently my financial security wasn't. I looked around my kitchen at the cabinets I'd painted myself when money was tight during George's first layoff, at the little herb garden on the windowsill that I'd been nurturing for 15 years, growing basil and oregano and thyme in coffee cans because we couldn't afford proper planters. I looked at the coffee mug collection from all the family vacations, where I'd paid for everything, while George complained about the expense, and Courtney documented her life for social media, posing with gelato in Rome and fish and chips in London, while I calculated exchange rates and worried about our credit card balance. The refrigerator hummed behind me, covered with photographs held up by souvenir magnets from trips that had cost us thousands. Courtney's high school graduation, trip to Europe, her college spring break in Cancun, the family cruise where she'd spent more on the spa than I made in a week. In every photo, she was smiling that radiant smile that had convinced me to say yes to every request, every demand, every emergency that required my immediate financial intervention. "I need to think about it," I said, and Courtney's face transformed into something I barely recognized as my daughter. The sweet expression she'd worn while describing the wedding venue shifted like a mask being removed, revealing something underneath that was harder and colder than I'd ever seen before. "Think about it. Mom, this is my wedding we're talking about. This is supposed to be the most important day of my life, and you're going to make me beg for money that's basically mine anyway?" She pulled out her phone, the latest iPhone that I'd bought her for Christmas, because her old one was embarrassingly outdated, and started typing furiously. "I'm texting Dad. Maybe he can talk some sense into you." I watched her fingers flying across the screen, her nails perfectly manicured in a shade called Millionaire's Dream that had cost $40 at the salon. Each tap against the glass sounded like a small judgment, like tiny gavels condemning me for having the audacity to hesitate before bankrupting my retirement for her wedding fantasy. Something shifted in my perspective as I watched her type, like when you're looking at one of those optical illusions and suddenly see the hidden image that was there all along. For the first time in 30 years of marriage and 28 years of motherhood, I saw the pattern clearly, spread out before me like a roadmap of my own diminishing returns. The first time Courtney had demanded money for something she needed, she was 16 and wanted a car. Not just any car, but a brand new Honda Civic, because all my friends have cars, and I'm the only one who has to get rides everywhere, and it's totally humiliating. George had sided with her immediately, nodding along as she explained how having a car would teach her responsibility and help her get a job to pay for gas and insurance. "We could afford it," he said, "if we just dipped into our savings a little bit." The car note lasted 3 years, but Courtney lost interest in driving after 6 months when she started dating a boy named Tyler who had a pickup truck and enjoyed playing chauffeur to the pretty girl who always had gas money. The car sat in our driveway for 2 years, accumulating parking tickets and repair bills, while Courtney insisted she was too busy with school to deal with the responsibility of vehicle ownership. When we finally sold it, we got less than half of what we'd paid, and the difference came out of the same savings account that was supposed to fund our retirement. When she was 18, it was college tuition for a private art school that cost twice as much as the state university where she could have gotten the same degree. "I can't possibly go to state," she'd said with the same dramatic flair she was displaying now, flopping across my living room sofa like a dying swan. "That's where poor people go. That's where people go when they've given up on their dreams." George had nodded sagely and suggested we take out a second mortgage on the house, because education was an investment in our daughter's future. And what kind of parents would we be if we held her back from reaching her potential? We did take out that second mortgage, turning our nearly paid-off home back into a 20-year debt that would keep us working well into our 60s. Courtney changed her major 4 times, from graphic design to art therapy to business marketing to interdisciplinary studies, before dropping out junior year to find herself in a gap year that lasted 3 years and in phases. Included a 6-month backpacking trip through Europe that cost us another $8,000. At 23, she needed money for an apartment deposit because her credit was shot from the credit cards we'd helped her get to build her credit score. The cards she'd maxed out, buying clothes and electronics and dinners at restaurants, couldn't afford to eat it myself. The apartment was a trendy loft in the arts district that cost more per month than my mortgage payment. But Courtney insisted she needed to live somewhere that reflected her creative aspirations and professional goals. At 25, it was money for a business idea, a boutique that sold handmade jewelry she'd import from Etsy vendors and mark up 300%. She'd presented us with a business plan written on lavender stationery, complete with projected earnings that would have made her a millionaire within 5 years. The boutique lasted 8 months before she decided retail was beneath her creative vision and soul-crushing in its commercialism. And now, at 28, it was a $67,000 wedding for a marriage to a man named Stephen. I'd met exactly twice, both times when he needed to borrow money for his truck payments. Stephen worked construction when work was available and spent his free time restoring vintage motorcycles that never seemed to run properly. He was handsome in a rough-around-the-edges way that I could understand appealing to Courtney, but he had the same relationship with money that she did. It was something that came from other people when you needed it, not something you earned and saved and planned for. "Your father agrees with me," Courtney announced, reading George's response from her phone screen. "He says family is supposed to support each other and that you're being selfish." She said the word selfish like it tasted bitter in her mouth, like it was the worst possible thing anyone could be accused of being. I almost laughed at the word selfish, but the sound caught in my throat like a fishbone. I'd worked full-time as an administrative assistant for 30 years while also managing the household, raising Courtney, and taking care of George's mother Alice for the last 8 years of her life. Alice had been a sweet woman, but dementia had made her suspicious and paranoid, convinced that strangers were stealing her belongings and that I was trying to poison her with her medications. I'd postponed my own dreams, my own education, my own interests, to make sure everyone else got what they needed. I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for lunch for 15 years so we could afford Courtney's dance classes, her gymnastics lessons, her violin instruction that she quit after 2 months because the teacher was mean and didn't understand her artistic vision. I'd bought my clothes at thrift stores and outlet malls so we could afford her brand-name jeans and designer backpacks and the endless stream of sports equipment for activities she'd try once and abandon. I'd worked overtime during the holidays so we could afford the Christmas mornings where Courtney got everything on her wish list, while I got a bottle of drugstore perfume and a gift card to the department store where I bought everyone else's clothes. I'd postponed my own doctor's appointments, my own dental work, my own needs for so long that I'd forgotten I was allowed to have them. The last time I'd bought myself something purely for pleasure, not a necessity, not something the family needed, but something I wanted just because I wanted it, was so long ago I couldn't remember what it had been. A book, maybe, or a small plant for my kitchen windowsill. Something under $10 that I'd felt guilty about for weeks afterward. "Mom, are you even listening to me?" Courtney's voice was getting shrill now, the way it used to when she was 3 and didn't get her way in the grocery store. That same rising note of panic and indignation that suggested the world was fundamentally unfair and that I had the power to fix it if I would just be reasonable. "I'm listening," I said, and I was. I was listening to 30 years of being treated like a family resource rather than a family member. I was listening to the sound of my own voice, disappearing a little more each year as everyone else's got louder and more demanding. I was listening to the echo of my mother's voice in my head, telling me that good mothers sacrifice everything for their children, that good wives support their husbands' decisions, even when those decisions were financial disasters, that good women don't make waves, or cause trouble, or put their own needs first. But I was also listening to something else, a small, clear voice that sounded suspiciously like my own, asking when exactly I'd become a supporting character in my own life. When had I stopped being Angela, the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in English literature, who'd once written poetry and dreamed of traveling to see the places she'd read about in books? When had I become just Mom and George's wife and the one who handles everything? "The wedding is in 4 months, Mom. I need an answer by the end of the week so we can finalize the venue and the catering." Courtney was back to scrolling through her phone, probably looking at pictures of Italian villas and calculating how much of my life savings each aperitif would cost. Stephen's family is contributing $5,000, which is honestly embarrassing, but at least they're trying. This is really going to be all on us. $5,000 from Stephen's family versus $67,000 from mine. I wondered if Courtney had even heard herself speak, if she'd registered the massive imbalance in what she was expecting from each side of the family. Stephen's parents owned a small farm outside of town and drove pickup trucks that were older than Courtney was, but apparently their $5,000 was embarrassing, while my entire life savings was just the reasonable contribution of loving parents. I nodded and watched. Her leave? Her heels clicking across the hardwood floors that I'd refinished myself 3 summers ago. while George watched football and Courtney complained about the smell of the stain from her childhood bedroom that she'd moved back into. After her boutique failed, the sound of her departure echoed through the house like a countdown timer, marking the moments until my next financial crisis would arrive. That night, I lay in bed next to George, listening to him snore and watching the ceiling fan make the same rotation it had been making for 15 years. The blades needed dusting, and I made a mental note to add it to my weekend list. Right after cleaning the gutters and organizing the garage and washing the windows and all the other tasks that had somehow become my responsibility, even though I worked just as many hours as George did. The moonlight filtering through our bedroom curtains cast shadows that moved with the fan blades, creating a pattern on the ceiling that reminded me of the sundial in my grandmother Isabel's garden. Isabel had left me that house when she died, along with enough money for a down payment on a home of my own. I'd been 24 then, fresh out of college and full of plans for my future. I was going to be a teacher, maybe write children's books on the side, live in a little house with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. Instead, I'd met George 6 months later, and somehow my inheritance had become our down payment on our house. My career plans had become something to think about later, and my dreams had been filed away like tax documents from years past, important ones, but no longer relevant to daily life. I thought about Courtney's words. "You're not going to live forever." She wasn't wrong. At 62, I probably had maybe 20 good years left if I was lucky. 20 years to enjoy the money I'd spent 30 years saving, $1 at a time, skipping lunches and shopping clearance sales, and driving my car until the repair bills exceeded its value. 20 years to maybe travel somewhere other than family reunions and vacation destinations chosen by committee. 20 years to discover who I might be if I wasn't constantly managing everyone else's needs and wants and crises. But if I gave Courtney the money, those 20 years would be spent working until I dropped, hoping my body held out long enough to keep me out of poverty in my old age. I'd be the old woman checking prices at the grocery store, choosing between medications and meals, hoping my daughter would remember to check on me occasionally between her Instagram posts from Italian restaurants and spa weekends. I imagined myself at 82, living in a studio apartment because that's all I could afford on Social Security, eating canned soup and watching game shows while Courtney lived in the house that my wedding money had helped her buy, posting pictures of her children, my grandchildren at birthday parties I couldn't afford to attend because I'd given her my gift money decades earlier. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. My supervisor, Janet, sounded genuinely concerned when I told her I wasn't feeling well. "Angela, you never get sick. Are you sure you're okay? Do you need to see a doctor?" I almost laughed at the question. When was the last time I'd been to a doctor for anything other than an annual physical? When was the last time I'd called in sick for any reason? I'd worked through colds and flu, through migraines and muscle strains, through the emotional exhaustion of caring for Alice while she descended into dementia and confusion. Instead of going to work, I drove to the library, the main branch downtown, with the marble steps and tall windows that I'd always loved but never had time to visit. I spent 6 hours in the reference section, researching divorce attorneys and retirement planning and rental properties in other states. I learned some very interesting things about asset protection and about how much my house had appreciated since we'd bought it in 1995. I also learned that in our state, property acquired before marriage remains separate property unless it's explicitly combined with marital assets. The house George and I lived in had been purchased with money from my grandmother, Isabel's estate, money that came to me 6 months before George and I got married. The deed was in both our names, but the original down payment had come from my separate property, which meant I might have a stronger claim to the house than I'd realized. The librarian, a woman about my age named Susan, helped me find books on financial planning for women over 60. "Are you thinking about retirement?" she asked kindly, and I realized that yes, I was thinking about retirement, but not the kind I'd been planning for 30 years. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," I told her, and she smiled like she understood exactly what I meant. Wednesday, I took another sick day and met with an attorney named Patricia Hendricks, a woman about my age who listened to my story with the kind of focused attention I hadn't received from another human being in years. Her office was in a converted Victorian house near the courthouse, with tall windows and bookshelves that reached the ceiling. She poured me coffee in a real china cup, not a disposable one, and took notes on a yellow legal pad while I talked. "How much of your retirement savings is in accounts that are solely in your name?" she asked, her pen poised over the paper. "All of it," I said. "I opened the account when I was 25, before I married George. I've been the only one contributing to it because George said his pension would be enough for both of us." Patricia nodded and made a note. "And what kind of pension does George have?" I laughed, and it came out more bitter than I'd intended. "He doesn't. He was laid off from the plant 8 years ago and never found another job with benefits. He's been working part-time at the hardware store ever since, making $12 an hour and pretending it's temporary while he waits for his Social Security to kick in." She made another note. "So your retirement savings is actually the only retirement savings?" "Yes, and George knows this. But somehow he's convinced himself that we'll be fine because Social Security will cover our basic expenses. He doesn't seem to understand that Social Security isn't designed to maintain the lifestyle we've been living. And your daughter wants you to spend all of it on her wedding. All of it. Every penny I've saved over 30 years of working. She wants me to liquidate my 401 Kelvins, pay the penalties and taxes, and hand over what's left so she can have a destination wedding in Italy." Patricia set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Angela, I've been practicing family law for 22 years, and I've seen a lot of women in your situation. Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded, feeling oddly relieved to have someone ask permission before probing into my life. "When was the last time someone in your family asked what you wanted? Not what you thought about their wants, or what you could do to help them get what they wanted, but what you actually wanted for yourself?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't remember. Not in recent memory, anyway. Maybe when Courtney was small and would ask what I wanted for my birthday. But even then, I usually said nothing, or just for you to be happy, because that seemed like what a good mother was supposed to say. George certainly hadn't asked what I wanted in years. Our conversations revolved around his needs, his job search, his aching back, his frustration with technology, his complaints about the neighbors or the weather or the state of the world. When had he last asked about my day, my dreams, my concerns about anything other than household management? "I don't know," I said finally, and the admission hung in the air between us like a confession. "Would you like to find out?" By Thursday, I'd opened a new bank account at a different bank across town and transferred my retirement savings into it. The process was simpler than I'd expected. A few forms, a phone call to my investment company, and suddenly my financial security was no longer accessible to anyone but me. I'd also gotten a realistic assessment of what my house was worth and what my equity stake would be in a divorce. The numbers were more encouraging than I'd dared to hope. Property values in our neighborhood had increased significantly over the past decade, and my separate property claim meant I might be entitled to more than half the proceeds from a sale. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making decisions instead of just reacting to other people's demands. Friday evening, Courtney came for dinner, expecting my answer about the wedding money. She brought a folder full of vendor estimates and venue photos, spreading them across my dining room table like a general planning a military campaign. The photos showed a stone villa overlooking rolling hills covered with grapevines. The kind of place I'd dreamed of visiting someday when I could afford to travel for pleasure instead of obligation. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her, setting down a plate of the meatloaf she'd loved as a child, the recipe I'd learned from my own mother and perfected over years of family dinners. "About how I'm not going to live forever. Courtney looked up from a picture of a Tuscan villa, suddenly attentive. Her eyes brightened with what I now recognized as anticipation. The same look she'd worn as a child on Christmas morning, when she was about to get everything she'd asked for. "And?" she prompted. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You're absolutely right. I probably have 20 years left if I'm lucky. Maybe 25 if I take care of myself. And I've decided I want to spend those years differently than I've spent the last 30. George was cutting his meatloaf into precise squares, not really listening to our conversation until he heard something in my tone that made him look up from his plate. His expression was wary, like he'd heard a sound that might indicate trouble but wasn't sure what kind yet. "What do you mean, differently?" Courtney asked, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice. "I mean, I've spent 30 years of my life making sure everyone else got what they wanted, and I've never once asked myself what I wanted. So I asked myself, and you know what I discovered?" Courtney was staring at me now, her fork suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth, a piece of meatloaf balanced precariously on the tines. "I discovered that I want to travel. I want to see Italy myself, not just pay for other people to see it. I want to take art classes and learn to paint watercolors. I want to rent a little apartment somewhere warm in the winters, and read books and drink good coffee, and not worry about anyone else's problems for a while." The silence that followed my words was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the sound of Mrs. Henderson's dog barking in the yard next door. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Courtney's voice was getting that edge again, the one that suggested I was being deliberately difficult and she was losing patience with my unreasonableness. "I'm talking about using my retirement money for my retirement. I'm talking about selling this house and splitting the proceeds with your father so we can both afford to live the lives we want separately." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in, the kitchen, and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. George set down his fork with a small clink against his plate. "You want a divorce? I want a life, George. I want to wake up in the morning and make decisions based on what I want to do, not what you need me to do or what Courtney needs me to pay for." Courtney's face had gone through several color changes, starting with confusion, moving through disbelief, and settling on a mottled red that reminded me of her toddler tantrums in the grocery store. "You can't be serious. You're going to destroy our family over money?" "I'm not destroying anything, sweetheart. I'm just opting out of a system where I give everything and everyone else takes everything. You want $67,000 for a wedding? Get a job. Work overtime. Save your money. Do what I did." "I have a job." "You work 20 hours a week at a boutique, Courtney. When I was your age, I was working 40 hours a week, taking care of a toddler and helping your father build his career. If you want an expensive wedding, you can do what millions of other people do. You can earn it." George was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, his mouth slightly open as if he was trying to catch words that wouldn't come. "Angela, let's not make any hasty decisions. Maybe we can compromise. Maybe Courtney could scale back the wedding a little, and we could help with part of the cost." I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw a man who had spent 30 years assuming I would always be there to subsidize his choices and cushion his mistakes. A man who had never once asked what I might want to do with my own money, my own time, my own life. Even now, faced with my Declaration of Independence, his first instinct was to negotiate a compromise that would still require my financial sacrifice. "The decision isn't hasty, George. It's 30 years overdue." Courtney slammed her hand on the table, making the water glasses jump and the silverware rattle. "This is insane. Mom, you're having some kind of breakdown. People don't just throw away their families because they want to go on vacation." "You're right," I said calmly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "People don't just throw away their families. But I'm not throwing you away, Courtney. I'm just declining to fund your every whim with my retirement security. You'll always be my daughter, but you're also a grown woman who needs to learn to support herself. And what about me? George's voice was quiet, but I could hear the panic underneath, like a small animal caught in a trap. What am I supposed to do? You're supposed to do what every other divorced man your age does. You're supposed to figure out how to take care of yourself. You've got equity in this house. You've got Social Security coming in a few years. You've got 2 working hands and a functioning brain. You'll be fine. The truth was, George would probably be better than fine. Without me managing every aspect of his life, he might actually have to develop some independence and self-reliance. He might even discover that he was more capable than he'd let himself believe during 30 years of learned helplessness. Courtney was scrolling through her phone frantically, her fingers moving so fast they were almost a blur. I'm calling Grandma Isabel. She'll talk sense into you. Your grandmother Isabel is dead, Courtney. She died 5 years ago. You were at the funeral. I remembered that day clearly. Courtney had spent most of the service checking her phone and complaining about the uncomfortable shoes I'd bought her for the occasion. I meant Grandma Alice. George's mother Alice died 3 years ago. I took care of her for the last 8 years of her life, while you were finding yourself, and George was between careers. I'm sure you remember you were too busy to help, but not too busy to inherit her jewelry when she passed. The jewelry had been worth more than I'd expected, nearly $15,000 according to the appraiser. Courtney had sold most of it within 6 months to fund another failed business venture, something involving handmade soaps that she'd never actually learned to make. Courtney's face crumpled suddenly, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort and security from the mother who always made everything better. Mom, please, this is my wedding. This is supposed to be the happiest time of my life. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the expensive manicure she'd gotten with money she'd borrowed from me 2 weeks earlier. Her skin was soft and warm, and I remembered all the times I'd held this hand while teaching her to tie her shoes, to write her name, to navigate the small disappointments of childhood. Sweetheart, if your happiness depends on other people giving you $67,000, then you need to examine what's making you happy. A marriage should be about love and commitment, not about how much money you can spend on one party. It's not just a party. It's the beginning of Stephen and my life together. Then begin that life the way you intend to continue it, by working together to build something instead of expecting other people to hand it to you. George was staring into his meatloaf like it might contain the answers to life's mysteries. How long have you been thinking about this? I've been thinking about it for years, George. Every time you agreed to something that would cost us money without asking me first, every time you assumed I would just go along with whatever Courtney wanted, because saying no might make me look like a bad mother. Every time you treated my paycheck like community property and your wants like personal necessities. I stood up and started clearing the table, not because I was angry, but because 30 years of habit die hard. The familiar rhythm of stacking plates and gathering silverware gave my hands something to do while my mind processed the magnitude of what I was about to change. I've already spoken to an attorney. I've already moved my retirement savings to a separate account. I'll be filing for divorce next week. Courtney was crying now, but they were the frustrated tears of someone who wasn't getting her way, not the heartbroken tears of someone losing something precious. You can't do this. What will people think? People will think that a 62-year-old woman finally decided to live her own life instead of funding everyone else's dreams. George pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. I need a drink. There's beer in the garage refrigerator, I said automatically, then caught myself. Actually, George, you can buy your own beer from now on, with your own money. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and difficult conversations, and small acts of rebellion that felt revolutionary after 30 years of compliance. Courtney tried everything from emotional manipulation to outright hostility to convince me to change my mind. She told me I was being selfish, that I was ruining her life, that I would regret this decision for the rest of my life and die alone and unloved. She brought Stephen to the house to talk to me, thinking perhaps that his masculine presence would convince me to see reason. Stephen was as handsome as I remembered, in a rough-around-the-edges way that I could understand appealing to my daughter. But when he opened his mouth to speak, what came out was the same entitled attitude that Courtney displayed, the same assumption that other people's money was available for his use. "Mrs. Angela," he said, settling into my living room like he owned it, "I know this is hard for you, but Courtney and I really need your help here. We're young, we're just starting out, and this wedding is really important to us." I watched him as he spoke, noting the expensive watch on his wrist, a gift from Courtney, no doubt, purchased with money she'd borrowed from me for emergency expenses. His work boots were new and barely scuffed, suggesting that his construction job wasn't as demanding as he liked to pretend. "Stephen," I said carefully, "how much money do you and Courtney have saved for this wedding?" He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, we've got some saved up, but weddings are expensive, you know. We figured family would help out." "How much do you have saved?" "Like $3,000, maybe?" $3,000 saved for a $67,000 wedding. I wondered if either of them had ever done the math, if they understood that they were asking me to contribute more than 20 times what they'd managed to save themselves. George alternated between pleading and anger, sometimes within the same conversation. He couldn't understand how I could just walk away from 30 years of marriage, as if those 30 years had been some kind of gift he'd given me, rather than a shared experience that had gradually become more and more one-sided. "I've been a good husband to you, Angela," he said one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway while I cooked dinner for one instead of 3. "I've never cheated. I've never hit you. I've always been faithful." "You've been faithful, yes," I agreed, stirring the pasta sauce I'd made with ingredients I'd bought for myself without worrying about whether anyone else would like it. "But you haven't been a partner. You've been a passenger." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that for 30 years, I've been driving this marriage while you've been sitting in the passenger seat, complaining about the route I chose and telling me to pull over whenever you saw something you wanted." He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, and I realized that he genuinely didn't understand what I was talking about. In his mind, he had been a good husband, because he'd fulfilled the basic requirements. He'd been faithful. He'd worked when work was available. He'd never been physically abusive. The idea that marriage might require more than simply not doing terrible things had never occurred to him. But the most interesting thing happened about 3 weeks into the process. I was boxing up some of my books when I found an old journal from the early years of our marriage, buried beneath a stack of photo albums and recipe collections. I'd forgotten I used to write in it, and I spent an hour reading entries from my younger self, a woman who seemed like a stranger to me now. The woman in those journal pages had dreams. She wanted to go back to school and study art history. She wanted to travel to museums in Europe and see the paintings she'd only read about in books. She wanted to write, not anything important, just stories and observations about the world around her. She'd had opinions about politics and literature and movies that weren't just echoes of what other people thought. She'd also been lonely, I realized as I read her careful handwriting on pages yellowed with age. Even in the early years of marriage, when George was still trying to impress me and Courtney was a sweet-natured toddler who thought I hung the moon, the woman in that journal had felt isolated and misunderstood. She'd written about feeling like she was performing a role rather than living a life, going through the motions of being a wife and mother while some essential part of herself remained locked away and unexpressed. I feel like I'm disappearing. She'd written in one entry dated just 3 months after our wedding. Every day I become a little less Angela and a little more George's wife. I catch myself agreeing with opinions I don't actually hold, laughing at jokes I don't find funny, pretending to enjoy activities that bore me senseless. Who am I becoming? And why does it feel like the price of love is the gradual erasure of self? Reading those words 30 years later felt like receiving a message from a past version of myself who'd tried to warn me about the path I was choosing. That young woman had seen the danger signs, had recognized the pattern of self-sacrifice that would eventually consume her entirely, but she'd ignored her own instincts in favor of being the woman everyone else needed her to be. During this time, I also had several enlightening conversations with people I'd known for years but never really talked to honestly. My sister-in-law, Matthew's wife, Linda, called me one afternoon, ostensibly to check on me after hearing about the divorce through the family grapevine. "You know, Angela," she said after we'd gotten through the polite preliminaries, "Matthew always said George was lucky to have someone who handled everything for him. He used to joke that George wouldn't last a week if you ever left him." "He said that?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "Oh, honey, we all said it. We used to marvel at how you managed to work full-time and still take care of everything at home while George just existed. I remember Matthew coming home from your family barbecues and telling me how George would sit in his chair the whole time while you served everyone and cleaned up and managed all the conversations. He said it was like watching someone wait to be served at a restaurant. It struck me that even George's own brother had recognized the imbalance in our relationship, but somehow George himself had remained oblivious to it. Or perhaps not oblivious, perhaps willfully blind, because acknowledging the inequality would have required him to change, and change was uncomfortable. My coworker Janet also surprised me with her honesty when I finally told her about the divorce during one of our lunch breaks. We were sitting in the employee break room, sharing a bag of pretzels she'd brought from home, when she set down her coffee cup and looked at me with something like relief in her eyes. "Angela, can I tell you something I've wanted to say for years, but never had the courage to?" I nodded, curious about what could require such courage to express. "I've always admired how capable you are, how you handle everything with such grace and efficiency. But I've also worried about you, because you never seem to do anything just for yourself. In 15 years of working together, I've never heard you mention a hobby, a personal interest, a vacation you wanted to take. It's always been about what your family needed, what they wanted, what crisis you were managing for them." She paused, studying my face. "I used to wonder if you even knew who you were anymore underneath all that caretaking. And I wanted to ask, but it seemed too personal, too intrusive. But now that you're making this change, I have to say I'm proud of you. I'm proud that you're finally putting yourself first." Her words stayed with me for days, making me realize how visible my self-erasure had been to the people around me. I'd thought I was being a good wife and mother, but what I'd actually been doing was teaching everyone in my life that my needs didn't matter, that my dreams were expendable, that my role was to facilitate everyone else's happiness while quietly surrendering my own. The divorce proceedings moved more quickly than I'd expected. George hired a lawyer who specialized in trying to maximize alimony payments. But Patricia had done her homework. The house had indeed been purchased with my separate property, and my retirement account had always been in my name alone. George's part-time job at the hardware store barely qualified as income, and his years of unemployment during our marriage actually worked against him in the settlement negotiations. "Your husband's attorney is arguing that he's entitled to half of everything because marriage is a partnership," Patricia explained during one of our meetings. "But a partnership implies that both parties are contributing equally. George has been unemployed or underemployed for most of the last decade, while you've been the primary breadwinner. The court is likely to see this as a case of financial dependency rather than partnership. She was right. When the final settlement was reached, I retained ownership of the house and my retirement accounts, while George received a lump sum payment that would give him enough to rent an apartment and start over. It wasn't generous, but it was more fair than 30 years of one-sided financial support had been. Courtney's reaction to the final divorce decree was swift and predictable. She called me at work, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. "Mom, you've ruined everything. Stephen's parents are so embarrassed by our family drama that they're talking about postponing the wedding. How could you do this to me? How could you destroy my happiness for your own selfish reasons?" I listened to her sob into the phone, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I'd raised a daughter who saw my financial independence as a personal attack on her happiness. Relief because I was no longer responsible for managing her emotional reactions to life's disappointments. "Courtney," I said when her crying subsided enough for her to hear me, "your happiness was never my responsibility. It was always yours. And if Stephen's family is embarrassed by my decision to live my own life, then maybe you should ask yourself what kind of family you're marrying into." "I hate you," she said, and hung up the phone. I stared at the receiver for a long moment, feeling oddly peaceful. She didn't hate me. Of course, she hated that she could no longer manipulate me into funding her lifestyle. But the distinction was important, and I was finally clear-sighted enough to see it. The house felt different once the divorce was final and George had moved out. It wasn't just quieter, it was calmer, like a storm had passed and left clear skies behind. I found myself noticing things I'd been too busy to see before. The way the morning light fell across the kitchen table, the sound of birds singing in the backyard, the way my own footsteps sounded when I wasn't trying to move quietly to avoid waking someone else. I hired a cleaning service to deep clean the house after George took his belongings, not because I couldn't do it myself, but because I wanted to mark the transition with something symbolic. The women who came were immigrants from Guatemala who spoke limited English, but communicated perfectly through smiles and gestures. They worked with an efficiency and attention to detail that impressed me, transforming my familiar spaces into something that felt fresh and new. When they finished, I walked through the house room by room, seeing it as if for the first time. Without George's recliner dominating the living room, the space opened up and breathed. Without his piles of mail and newspapers cluttering every surface, the rooms felt serene and organized. Without his constant presence and needs and complaints, the house felt like mine again. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in October, exactly 8 months after Courtney had demanded my retirement savings for her wedding. I celebrated by driving to the art supply store and buying myself a set of watercolor paints, brushes, and paper, not the cheap student-grade supplies I might have bought for Courtney when she was going through her artistic phase, but professional quality materials that cost more than I'd spent on myself in years. The woman behind the counter, an artist in her 40s with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes, helped me select everything I needed to get started. "Are you taking a class?" she asked as she rang up my purchases. "I'm starting over," I told her, and she smiled like she understood exactly what I meant. I also enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community college, something I'd wanted to do for years but never had time for, between work and household management and family crises. The class met Tuesday evenings in a bright studio space with tall windows and good lighting, and I found myself looking forward to it all week. My instructor was a woman named Claire who was about my age and had the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of pursuing something you love. She didn't judge my amateur attempts or make me feel foolish for starting something new at 63. Instead, she encouraged experimentation and reminded us that the goal was joy, not perfection. "Art isn't about creating something beautiful," she said during our first class, watching us struggle with basic color mixing. "Art is about discovering something true. And the truth is that you're allowed to play, to make mistakes, to learn something new about yourself through the act of creation. I was terrible at watercolors, just as I'd expected to be. My attempts at painting flowers looked more like colorful accidents, and my landscapes resembled abstract expressionist nightmares. But I loved it anyway. Loved the unpredictability of the paint bleeding across wet paper. Loved the way colors mixed in ways I couldn't control. Loved the meditative focus required to lose myself in the process. For 3 hours every Tuesday evening, I existed in a world where my only responsibility was to myself and my painting. Nobody needed anything from me. Nobody was waiting for me to solve their problems or fund their dreams. I was just Angela, learning to see color and light and shadow in ways I'd never noticed before. The other women in the class were mostly my age or older, women who'd raised children and managed households, and were now reclaiming parts of themselves they'd set aside for decades. We didn't talk much about our personal lives, but there was an understanding between us, a recognition of shared experience that didn't need to be articulated. One evening after class, a woman named Dorothy, who painted delicate botanical studies, invited me for coffee. We sat in a small cafe near the college, warming our hands around ceramic mugs and talking about everything except painting. "My daughter thinks I'm having a midlife crisis," Dorothy confided, stirring sugar into her latte. "She can't understand why I want to spend my retirement doing frivolous things instead of babysitting my grandchildren for free." I nodded, recognizing the familiar dynamic. "My daughter thinks I ruined her life by getting divorced instead of funding her wedding." "Ah," Dorothy said with a knowing smile. "You're one of those mothers." "What kind of mothers?" "The kind who finally figured out that raising independent adults means actually letting them be independent. It's harder than it sounds, isn't it? Letting them fail, letting them struggle, letting them figure out that money doesn't grow on trees and that their happiness isn't anyone else's job." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching college students hurry past the cafe windows with their backpacks and their earnest expressions and their assumption that life would always provide them with what they needed. "Do you regret it?" Dorothy asked finally. "The divorce, I mean." I considered the question seriously, thinking about the loneliness of eating dinner alone, the quiet of a house with no one else's schedule to accommodate, the strange freedom of making decisions without consulting anyone else. "No," I said finally. "I regret waiting so long to do it." The first winter after my divorce was the coldest on record, with snow falling from November through March and temperatures that rarely rose above freezing. But I found I didn't mind the cold the way I used to. Without George complaining about the heating bills, I kept the house as warm as I wanted. Without having to coordinate schedules with anyone else, I could come and go as I pleased, bundling up for walks in the snow-covered neighborhood whenever the mood struck me. I also started volunteering at the art museum, giving tours to school groups and learning more about the paintings I'd always loved from a distance. The museum director, a woman named Sarah, who was probably 15 years younger than me, but possessed an impressive knowledge of art history, trained me herself. Most of our volunteers are retirees who want to stay intellectually engaged, she explained as we walked through the galleries together. "But you're different. You ask questions that show you're really thinking about the work, not just memorizing facts to repeat to visitors." The volunteer training lasted 6 weeks and covered everything from basic art history to public speaking techniques to handling difficult visitors. I discovered that I had a natural talent for explaining complex ideas in simple terms and for managing groups of restless teenagers who'd been dragged to the museum against their will. My first solo tour was a group of 8th graders from a middle school in the poorest part of town. They arrived sullen and uninterested, clearly expecting to be bored by old paintings and stuffy adults. But something about their resistance sparked something in me, a determination to reach them that surprised me with its intensity. "Okay," I said, standing in front of a large abstract painting that looked like an explosion of color and motion. Before I tell you anything about this painting, I want you to tell me what you see. Not what you think you're supposed to see, not what you think the artist intended, but what you actually see when you look at it." A girl with bright purple hair and multiple piercings raised her hand tentatively. "It looks like anger," she said quietly, "like someone was really mad and threw paint at the wall." "Yes," I said, and her face lit up with surprise. "It does look like anger. And you know what? The artist probably was angry when he painted this. He was painting during a time when the world felt chaotic and frightening, and he was trying to capture that feeling in color and movement." For the next hour, I watched those kids discover that art wasn't about knowing the right answers. It was about looking carefully and trusting their own responses. They asked questions I'd never considered, made observations that surprised me with their insight, and left the museum talking excitedly about paintings they'd connected with. "That was amazing," Sarah told me afterward. "I've never seen a group of kids that engaged with the collection." "What did you do differently?" "I treated them like they were smart enough to understand art," I said. "Because they are." Spring came early that year, with crocuses pushing through the snow in February and daffodils blooming by St. Patrick's Day. I spent hours in my garden, which had been neglected during the years when I was too busy managing everyone else's lives to nurture my own small plot of earth. The vegetable garden that I'd started 20 years ago had been overrun with weeds, but the bones of it were still there. The raised beds I'd built myself, the trellis system for climbing plants, the compost bin where I'd been turning kitchen scraps into rich soil for decades. I spent weekends clearing out the weeds and dead plants, preparing the soil for a new growing season. For the first time in years, I planned a garden based entirely on what I wanted to grow. No more endless rows of tomatoes because George insisted on having them, even though he complained that my sauce was never as good as his mother's. No more green beans that no one but me would eat. Instead, I planted herbs for cooking, flowers for cutting, and vegetables I actually enjoyed eating. I also started planning my trip to Italy, the one I'd been dreaming about since I was 25, and reading about Renaissance art in college textbooks. I spent hours researching museums and galleries, mapping out an itinerary that would take me to Florence and Rome and Venice, places I'd only seen in photographs but had always longed to experience in person. The travel agent I worked with was a woman named Maria who specialized in solo travel for women over 50. She understood that this wasn't just a vacation, it was a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey to reclaim parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. First-time solo travelers often worry about being lonely, she told me as we planned my itinerary. But what most of them discover is that traveling alone allows them to be fully present in ways they never could be when they were managing other people's needs and preferences. She was right. Just the act of planning the trip, choosing hotels, researching restaurants, deciding which museums to visit, felt like an act of radical self-care after 30 years of deferring to other people's preferences. Courtney called me in May, 8 months after our confrontation over the wedding money. I was in my garden when the phone rang, planting basil and oregano in the herb spiral I'd designed and built myself. "Mom," she said, and I could hear something different in her voice, less certain, more vulnerable than the entitled anger I'd grown accustomed to. "Hello, Courtney. How are you?" I wanted to tell you that Stephen and I postponed the wedding." I waited, sensing there was more to this story. "We've been trying to save money for it, like you said we should, and it's harder than we thought it would be. We both had to get second jobs, and we're living in a really small apartment, and it's been stressful. I'm sorry, it's been difficult," I said, and I meant it. I didn't enjoy watching my daughter struggle, but I also knew that struggle was often the only path to genuine growth. Stephen's been working construction during the day and delivering pizza at night, and I've been working at the boutique and cleaning houses on weekends. We've saved about $15,000 so far, but we realized that even if we saved for 2 more years, We still couldn't afford the wedding we originally planned. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. I wanted to call and tell you that I think I understand now why you said no. Not just about the money, but about everything. I never realized how hard it was to actually earn money and save it and make it last. I always just thought it would be there when I needed it. And now? I asked gently. Now I understand that money represents time and work and choices. When I ask someone to give me $67,000, I'm asking them to give me years of their life. And that's not fair, is it? I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. This was the conversation I'd been hoping to have with my daughter for years, not an argument about money, but a recognition of value and effort and reciprocity. No, sweetheart, it's not fair. But I'm proud of you for figuring that out. We're going to have a smaller wedding, she continued, in the park pavilion where you used to take me when I was little. Stephen's building us an arch out of reclaimed wood, and I'm making my own dress. It won't be Italy, but it'll be ours. That sounds beautiful, I said, and I meant it. Mom, would you help us with the flowers? Not pay for them, but help us plan them? You always had such a beautiful garden, and I thought maybe we could use flowers from your yard, and I could learn how to arrange them myself. I stood in my garden, surrounded by the plants I'd nurtured back to life, holding a phone conversation with a daughter who finally sounded like the woman I'd hoped she'd become. I would love to help with the flowers, I told her. We talked for another hour about wedding plans and garden design and the small discoveries that come from learning to live within your means. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: optimism about my relationship with my daughter. The wedding took place in September, on a warm afternoon when the late summer light made everything look golden and forgiving. Courtney wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, with lace from her grandmother Isabel's wedding veil sewn into the sleeves. Stephen had indeed built them a beautiful arch from weathered barnwood, decorated with flowers from my garden, white roses and purple asters, and trailing ivy that smelled like earth and rain. The guest list was small, maybe 40 people, instead of the 200 they'd originally planned. But the celebration felt more intimate and genuine than any expensive destination wedding could have been. Stephen's parents brought homemade wine from grapes they'd grown themselves, and Courtney's friends contributed potluck dishes that reflected their actual relationships rather than the catered perfection of a professional event. I sat in the front row, wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, not something practical that I could wear to work later, but a beautiful blue silk that made me feel elegant and celebratory. George was there too, looking uncomfortable in a suit that no longer fit properly, accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize, who turned out to be a coworker from the hardware store. During the ceremony, as Courtney and Stephen exchanged vows they'd written themselves, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, we'd been locked in a battle over money and entitlement, and the meaning of family obligation. Now we were celebrating a wedding that represented everything I'd hoped to teach my daughter about love and commitment and the satisfaction that comes from building something together. After the ceremony, Courtney found me by the dessert table, where I was admiring the cake she and Stephen had made themselves, a simple 2-layer vanilla cake with buttercream frosting and fresh flowers from my garden. "Mom, thank you," she said, taking my hand in hers. "Not just for the flowers, but for not giving me the money. I know that sounds crazy, but if you just handed over your retirement savings, Stephen and I never would have learned what we were capable of. We never would have discovered that we could actually build something together, instead of just expecting other people to provide it for us." I squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses she'd developed from her cleaning jobs and her wedding preparations. "You're welcome, sweetheart. I'm proud of the woman you've become. I have something for you," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small wrapped package. "I know it's not traditional for the bride to give the mother a gift, but I wanted you to have this." I unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small framed watercolor painting, not one of mine, but a delicate study of wildflowers that looked like it had been painted by someone with real skill. "I painted it myself," Courtney said, blushing slightly. "I've been taking art classes at the community college, and the instructor said I have natural talent. I thought maybe we could paint together sometime." "I know you've been taking classes too." I stared at the painting, seeing not just the flowers, but the hours of practice and observation that had gone into creating something so lovely. My daughter had learned to see beauty and capture it with her own hands, had developed a skill that no one could take away from her, or devalue, or use against her. "It's beautiful, Courtney. I would love to paint with you." The reception lasted until well after dark, with string lights that Stephen had hung in the trees and music from a playlist they'd created together. I danced with old friends and new acquaintances, ate cake that tasted better because it represented effort rather than expense, and watched my daughter celebrate a marriage that had been built on partnership rather than expectation. George approached me as the evening was winding down, looking more serious than I'd seen him in years. "Angela, I owe you an apology," he said, his hands stuffed in his pockets like a nervous teenager. "For what?" "For not seeing what I was taking from you all those years. For assuming you'd always be there, to handle everything, while I just coasted. I didn't realize how much work you were doing, how much of yourself you were giving up to keep the rest of us comfortable." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity, but found only genuine regret. "I'm doing better now," he continued. "Living with Matthew has been good for me. Having to cook my own meals and do my own laundry and manage my own schedule has made me realize how much I depended on you for things I should have been handling myself. I'm glad you're doing well, George. I heard you're going to Italy next month." "I am. 3 weeks in Florence, and Rome and Venice." He nodded, and for a moment I thought I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with 30 years ago, someone curious about the world, interested in experiences beyond his immediate comfort zone. "That sounds amazing. You always wanted to see those museums, didn't you?" "I did. I still do." "Well, I hope you have a wonderful time. You deserve it." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Courtney and Stephen clean up the remnants of their celebration with help from friends who'd stayed to lend a hand. "We did raise a good daughter," George said finally. "We did," I agreed. "Eventually." I left for Italy 3 weeks later, carrying a single suitcase and a small backpack containing my art supplies. The flight was the longest I'd ever taken alone, and I spent most of it reading guidebooks and trying not to second-guess my decision to travel solo for the first time in my life. But from the moment I stepped off the plane in Florence and heard Italian being spoken all around me, I knew I'd made the right choice. The city was everything I'd dreamed it would be. Narrow streets lined with Renaissance palaces, squares filled with sculptures and fountains, museums housing paintings I'd studied in books for decades. I spent my first morning at the Uffizi Gallery, standing in front of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and crying openly at the beauty of finally seeing it in person. Other tourists probably thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but I didn't care. After 63 years of putting everyone else's needs first, I was finally in the presence of something I'd longed to see for myself. The painting was smaller than I'd expected, but more luminous, with colors that photographs had never captured accurately. I stood there for nearly an hour, studying the details and trying to memorize the way the light fell across Venus's face, the way her hair seemed to move with the wind that carried her to shore. I painted every day during my 3 weeks in Italy, setting up my easel in piazzas and gardens, and along the banks of the Arno River. My watercolors were still amateurish, but they captured something essential about my experience, not just what the places looked like, but how they felt to someone who was finally free to see them. In Rome, I spent hours in the Vatican museums, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of art and history contained within those walls. I stood in the Sistine Chapel with my neck craned back, studying Michelangelo's ceiling and understanding for the first time why people had called it divine inspiration made visible. In Venice, I took a watercolor workshop with an Italian artist who spoke limited English but communicated perfectly through demonstrations and gentle corrections. She taught me how to capture the way light reflected off water, how to suggest the texture of ancient stone with just a few careful brushstrokes. "You paint with feeling," she told me in heavily accented English during our final class. "This is good. Technique can be learned, but feeling is gift." I returned home in October with a suitcase full of art supplies and a head full of memories. The house felt different when I walked through the door, not empty or lonely, but peaceful and mine, in a way it had never been before. I unpacked slowly, savoring the ritual of putting away souvenirs and hanging my amateur paintings on walls that finally reflected my own taste, rather than some imagined family aesthetic. Courtney called that evening to welcome me home and hear about my trip. We talked for 2 hours, and for the first time in our relationship, the conversation was reciprocal. She asked questions and listened to my answers, shared her own news without expecting me to solve her problems, treated me like a person with her own interesting experiences, rather than a resource to be managed. "I've been thinking about what you said before you left," she told me as our conversation was winding down, "about how travel changes the way you see yourself. I think maybe Stephen and I should plan a trip for our first anniversary. Nothing expensive, but somewhere we've never been, somewhere we can discover together." "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said, and meant it. "Mom, I love you, and I'm grateful for everything you've taught me, especially the hard lessons about independence and self-reliance. I know it would have been easier for you to just give me the money and avoid all the conflict, but I'm a better person because you didn't." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the year that had passed since Courtney's initial demand for my retirement savings. 12 months ago, I'd been a woman who'd forgotten she was allowed to have dreams of her own. Now, I was someone who'd traveled solo through Italy, learned to paint watercolors, discovered that she could live independently and find joy in solitude. The money I'd refused to spend on Courtney's original wedding plans was still there, earning interest and waiting to fund whatever adventure I chose next. Maybe another art class, maybe a workshop in France or Spain, maybe just the security of knowing I could take care of myself no matter what the future brought. I'm 64 now, officially retired from my administrative job and working part-time at the art museum because I love it, not because I need the income. My garden is the most beautiful it's ever been, full of plants I chose because they make me happy, rather than because they're practical or low maintenance. Courtney and Stephen are thriving in their small apartment, building a marriage based on partnership and mutual respect, rather than entitlement and expectation. They're saving money for a house, planning their anniversary trip, and learning the satisfaction that comes from creating a life together rather than expecting other people to fund their dreams. George is also doing well, living independently and working full-time for the first time in years. He's lost weight, learned to cook, and even started dating the woman from the hardware store. According to Matthew, he's become more confident and self-reliant than he'd ever been during our marriage. As for me, I'm planning my next adventure, a painting retreat in Tuscany next spring, where I'll spend 2 weeks learning from professional artists and exploring the countryside that captured my imagination during my first trip to Italy. This time, I'll go not as someone stealing a few weeks away from her responsibilities, but as someone whose life belongs entirely to herself. People ask me sometimes if I regret my decision, if I miss being married, if I'm lonely in my small world of art classes and museum tours and quiet evenings with books I choose myself. I tell them that loneliness and being alone are 2 different things. I was lonely for 30 years in a house full of people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Now, I'm alone sometimes, but I'm never lonely. I'm finally getting to know the woman I buried under all those years of being what everyone else needed me to be. And that woman it turns out, is someone I enjoy spending time with. The money that Courtney wanted me to spend on her wedding, my entire retirement savings is still growing in my investment account, waiting to fund whatever dreams I haven't discovered yet. Every month, the balance grows a little larger, representing not just financial security, but the freedom to choose my own path forward. It's not revenge, exactly what I did. Revenge implies wanting to hurt someone else, and I never wanted to hurt Courtney or George. I just wanted to stop hurting myself. I wanted to stop pretending that my own dreams and needs and wants were less important than everyone else's. The real victory isn't that my family learned to be more independent, though they did. The real victory is that I learned to value myself enough to live my own life, instead of just facilitating everyone else's. I'm 64 years old, and if Courtney was right about me not living forever, I've probably got about 20 years left to explore who I am when I'm not defined by what I can do for other people. 20 years to read the books I want to read, to see the places I want to see, to learn the things I want to learn. 20 years to live a life that's actually mine. And you know what I've discovered? She's someone worth knowing.